The future, a pathway to your destiny awaits. You are yet to realize it, but on this path, there are infinite versions of you waiting in the shadows, all living the life you could only ever dream of. But what if there was a way to become the very version of you you've always dreamed of? To move from a fixed persona and create a whole new version of yourself. To help you on your gifted path, your next set of remarkable masters awaiting. A best-selling author and world-renowned personality expert. A clinical psychologist and trauma specialist with over 5 million followers. And a leading expert in meditation for high performers all around the globe, who will all help you answer the question, how do I become my future self now?
I was telling my team earlier today, I love and have loved every conversation we've had so far on the Gifted Show. And I just had this intuitive hunch that this one that's about to happen will be one of my favorites, if not maybe even my favorite, and no pressure on our guests or anything like that. It's one of my favorite topics that lights me up the most. And I want to begin with a story, a personal story. So in 2011, I went through what I would consider a personal crisis. And at the time, I was in the real estate space in Toronto, doing insanely well. Like from 2009 to 2015, I had sold $200 million worth of real estate. So I was winning every award and being featured in magazines, and secretly hated myself. I did not like what I was doing, and I felt trapped in this weird space of how do you explain to people that you are quote unquote successful and not happy. And because of that turmoil, I started diving deep into personal development. And two activities that really helped me back then. The first one is I wrote my, in quotes, to-be list. So we've all probably written a to-do list with activities. And this exercise was around understanding who I wanted to become. And how it started was a list of qualities, characteristics, behavior traits that I loved about myself. And then I wrote a list of stuff I didn't love about myself. And I thought of what are the opposite of these traits. And I took the stuff I loved and the opposite of what I didn't, and I made my to-be list in 2011. And I just recently checked it and realized I've become that person. I became the person I wanted to become. And that process led me to start getting fascinated around the concept of identity. And can we change identity? And it's always been a hunch and a theory until I read this book by Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who's with us today. And he kind of cemented the science behind what I always thought was true. And the serendipity, 2 days ago, you know how Facebook gives you reminders of things you posted in the past? In April of 2018, I wrote this post on my Facebook profile. Question on my mind lately: when someone says be yourself, is the self a variable or a constant? Meaning, is identity constantly evolving so that 10 years from now you can become a completely different person by healing past pains, having unique experiences, and changing programming? Or is it more like a computer that comes with factory settings and an operating system that never changes? This is how long I've been thinking about this stuff. So when I read this book from Ben, it was game changing. And then he's a machine with this book thing. He decides to send me a copy of his 6th book, which is coming out in June, called Be Your Future Self Now. I read it. Both of these books have changed my life. And in the past couple of years, there were 2 other books that I have said changed my life. And I don't say this often. I love books. I have a giant library behind me. The second one was this one, Stress Less, Accomplish More, by Emily Fletcher, who's here with us, who's also the founder of Ziva Meditation. And then there was this person on Instagram I was following, and every single time she posted anything, it blew my mind. And I got so excited that I found out she was publishing a book, and it came out. And this book changed my life: How to Do the Work, Dr. Nicole LePera, who's also here with us. So I, I love all three of you already, and we've already, we're all friends and we've had our individual conversations. And I thought, how epic would it be to have the four of us go deep on this topic of identity and the idea that we can change it and how to change it, and how our past is connected to our present and our future, and how trauma is a part of all this. And I'm so excited to dive really deep. And I think, Ben, I'll start with you, just to give the paradigm shifting framework of this book, Personality Isn't Permanent. What does that mean? And, blow our minds, because I always had this hunch, but now you've proven it. So what does it mean when you say personality isn't permanent?
Okay. All right. So my thinking is a little distant from the topic of personality, but I'll share with you kind of my general thoughts about personality. So personality, like from a psychological standpoint, personality is external, identity is internal. And so personality is not the driver. In a lot of ways, personality is kind of the after effect. From my standpoint, identity is the driver, and even there's a driver of identity. And we can go into that later, but basically, yeah, your identity is your internal narrative. It's also just what you're most fundamentally committed to as a person, and your identity drives your behavior, and your behavior is reflected as your personality. So whatever like the most simple definition of personality is your consistent behavior over time. But obviously your personality today is different from your personality is 3 weeks ago or 5 years ago. And this is kind of where the research on future self and former self comes on, is that, and a lot of it comes from Dr. Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, but he's pretty much studied the difference between your current self, your former self, and your future self. And as a rule, even if someone has looked at their current self and they can easily see that they have different views, different values, different interests than their past self, we all still overly estimate how different our future self will be. But the truth of the matter is that your future self in 5 or 10 years from now is going to be completely different than your current self. Your future self is going to have a different situation, different context, different goals, different values. And so, yeah, personality is very, very flexible, very situational. And it's kind of honestly the least valuable aspect of all of this. It's kind of like, it's the most surface level aspect of a person, in my opinion.
Well, I see myself in the past, and many people I speak to, using phrases like, that's just the way I am, when something happens and there's a repeated behavior or habitual response to something. And I always used to struggle with that, because I realized, no, that's just your current set of behaviors. And I'll use my own experience first as a lens for all of us here, but there have been things in my past, even recently and then in way past, where I had behaviors that didn't serve me. And I would always struggle with this, thinking, it sucks that this is my current personality and this is what I was born with, and I have to deal with this. And this is why I'm so fascinated with this, because I'll give you an example. I always thought I was introverted. I'll use that word. And right? If you're ever in an event, I'll see people say, all the introverts raise your hand. And my favorite joke is like, no one's going to do it. But then how is it that I have no problems being around people? And I'm like, maybe, am I omniverted? And then I realized, why am I labeling this? What if I can completely become the opposite of this? What would that look like? And I used to be the most shy person ever, and I'm still calm and peaceful and reserved, but these things can all be changed. I think part of it is the foundational element of identification, of figuring out your starting point. And Nicole, I want to ask you, you offer a free future self journal, which anyone can download on your site, which is awesome. And one of the steps is witnessing patterns. And I love pattern recognition, but witnessing the patterns of the thoughts and the feelings that keep you stuck. And I'm interested, how does one witness the patterns without external feedback? There's this analogy that I love. How do you read the label of the jar you're in? So how do you even know they exist? What recommendation would you have to people around that starting point of figuring out the current thoughts and feelings as a pattern?
Yeah, absolutely. And similar to Dr. Ben, this idea that personality develops from something, and if I want to simplify it, I could say it develops from all of our past experiences, the adaptations, the reactions that absolutely, if we consistently repeat them enough, they get formed. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room, listeners, have heard of the concept of autopilot. Going back to that computer analogy, right? Am I born with the hardware, the software? A lot of us do drop into, by the time we're adults, an autopilot where any of us go through our day more often than not, and we do the typical patterns. We think the typical thoughts, and all of that is, again, stored in this deeper part of our mind that if we're not conscious to, like you're saying, if we're living in that jar, we're not even aware of what our patterns might be. So you'll always hear me shouting from the rooftops at this point of how important a foundational practice of becoming conscious to those patterns, of learning how to observe those actions, those thoughts, and even those feelings in ourselves. Of course, as you go down, peel back those layers of the onions, it gets more and more difficult to begin to observe those deeper parts of ourselves, but creating that separation, stepping out of the jar, learning to view the jar that we're in, to speak to your point, Giovanni, is incredibly important. And we do that through becoming conscious to what am I doing in action? What are the thoughts that maybe preceded the action or preceded the feeling that then led to the action? And we can literally become an observer, or like I say, a witness to all of that by practicing consciousness.
I love that word, consciousness. It's come up in many conversations. And I think as an overarching theme for today, the conversation I really want to be having is, how do we become the person that can make our dreams come true? And how do we consciously create an identity that we love so that that person can architect a life that we love? And I think, Emily, the bridge from current self to future self has meditation involved in that transformation. And I want to ask you specifically around a phrase called adaptation energy. So what is that? And how is it relevant to our transforming ourselves into our future selves?
Yeah, so there's so many themes and seeds here already, but if we were to sort of merge this idea of personality and identity with my world of consciousness, I would translate it into the identity is consciousness. The identity would be the ocean, and the personality would be the wave, right? So according to the Vedas, the Veda, ancient body of knowledge originating in northern India. It's not a doctrine or a dogma, it's not a religion, it's just a human interpretation of natural law. And the most foundational concept in the Vedas is that there is only one thing, and we are all it, and that one thing is consciousness. And so to me, the beauty in meditation is that it allows that wave of individuality, that left brain ego, to sort of de-excite and settle down and remember that it is also the ocean. And the thing I love about this style of meditation, that it really does celebrate both the individuality and the totality, the personality and the identity. And to your point, Dr. Nicole, it's like if all we ever have access to is that left brain wave, it's really hard to understand our future self, our past self. It's just here and now. I'm a victim to my circumstances. But if every day you start practicing consciousness, like you said, you get to de-excite and you're like, oh, wait, I am the ocean. That ocean doesn't really have a sense of time. Right? When you're in pure consciousness, you have transcended thinking. And so you transcend time, right? Time is a function of thought. And so if you can move beyond the realm of thinking, then you also move beyond the realm of time. So it becomes infinitely easier to actually crawl inside of the future you. And that's exactly why I created the technique that I created. So it's like, yes, you drop into the meditation, but then you end with the manifesting, right? It's like from that place of oceanness, from that place of pure consciousness, you ask the question, what would I love? And that's part of tapping into who is my future self? What are these dreams gearing me, what are these dreams gearing me into being? Because it's not about the dreams, right? The thing is never going to bring the fulfillment. Instead, to me, I like to think about our dreams as an indicator of where nature wants to use us to deliver our fulfillment. Cool. So none of that was answering your question about adaptation energy, but I'll pause there.
Okay, well, we'll loop back because you just popped point in my head that I want to circle with all three of you, which is what shapes identity more, our future or our past? So I'm going to start with Ben because I have a feeling I know his answer. And
Do you care if I actually share my screen?
yeah.
I just want to show a picture.
Yep.
It may be the easiest way for me to explain it. And others feel free to disagree. This is how I see it personally. There's a concept in philosophy known as teleology. Basically, the idea is that all behavior is driven by goals, literally all behavior. Everyone who's on this call had the goal of being here, like, or else you would not have been here. Most goals are not like explicit. Like if I want to get up and go to the bathroom, that end is the driver of me walking to the bathroom. If I want to go to the fridge and get food, like how Aristotle said it, Aristotle described it as final cause. And basically what Aristotle described is that the end is always the cause of the behavior. And so, you know, we all had the end of being at this meeting, which drove us to being here. And so part of becoming aware from my standpoint is being aware of the goals that are driving you. Typically, most people's goals are very short term, paying the bills, getting to the end of the day, getting to the weekend. But we're all being driven by a future. And that future, whatever it is you're absolutely most committed to, is the driver of your identity. And it's important to realize it's not the goal you want. Actually, there's a really good book, and I'll keep this super short, but there's a really good book called The 3 Laws of Performance by David Logan. I believe he's like a business management professor at USC. But in that book, they talk a lot about how we all have a default future that's driving us. And that default future is not the future we hope for. It's not the future we want. It's the future we already know intuitively is going to happen. And it's kind of the future we've committed ourselves to. Like back to the idea that your identity is what you're most committed to. Whatever you're actually going for, it could be, you know, in my case, obviously at some point I got super committed to writing books. There was a time before that when I wanted to do that, but I wasn't committed to doing that. It didn't become a part of my identity until it truly became something that I committed myself to. So from my standpoint, and obviously your goals are impacted by your past, by your experience, by your context. But often people's goals are actually purely reactive to their context. So like some people's goals, a lot of people's goals are just driven by those around them. And so I think that's the biggest aspect of becoming aware, in my opinion, is what are the goals that are driving me? Like, what's the subtle future that I'm being driven by? And changing the goal or changing the future is really how you start to change your identity. That's my standpoint. And then from there, behavior just follows. Behavior is the byproduct of your identity, which is the byproduct of whatever goals you're committed to.
Nicole, what do you think?
I think it's kind of similar to Dr. Hardy, what you're saying. I can't get that image now out of my head, of course. So where you have goals, I think I would put desires, like pings, inner longings, like a feeling based state, though it gets complicated because we, I think, are born universally with the same more or less 3 desires. We as a species need to be connected to other humans. It's based in our evolution. It's how we kept ourselves safe. We have that desire to connect. And within that desire, I feel like we all want to be seen and heard, right, by the people that we're connected to. And really simply, we just want to be who we are. So I think we all have that inner guidance, that intuition, that ping that happens when we're moving closer to something that makes us feel excited and expansive. That's a direction to continue to go in. And then, of course, the alternate side of that is when we start to feel fearful, constricted, and our energy shifts, telling us it's not the direction to go. Where it becomes complicated is because we're so adaptive. Whatever childhood environment we were born into, we adapt to that environment. So then we start to have experiences and make choices to deal with the environment around us, forming beliefs, usually about ourselves. When we're hurt, we might feel like we're unworthy of love, unworthy of connection. And the more consistently those things happen, then our current and our past reality begins to shape who we think we are. And then in a very autopilot way, we live into the future, like you're saying, based in this anticipated who I think I am, because this is the outcomes I've got my whole life operating within these beliefs, within these cycles. So why would I imagine my future is different? And the goal really for me is I describe it like an onion, peeling back, witnessing all of the conditioning that's keeping me separate from that deepest identity, that inner guidance, so that I can return to that, using that to then guide me throughout life. Because back to something we were kind of briefly touched on earlier, I believe that we're an evolving creature species in terms of our physical body, in terms of our emotional life. Like you said, we underestimate how different we're going to be, because difference and change is part of the human reality. So I think it's dangerous anytime we look for this fixed pattern, things to stay the same, life to be the same for us, because what we're really looking for is an inner way to guide ourselves through a changing experience. And that comes again when we go back to the past to be able to or peel back the effects of the past, I should say, to reconnect with the full, like you said, Emily, very beautifully, the ocean that we really are.
That just made me think of a ratio, because Giovanni, your question of like, which guides us more, the future or the past? And as you were speaking, Dr. Nicole, I thought of this like ratio, this ever-changing ratio, and that I believe that desires are divinely inspired, that nature is the one giving us desires so that we can bring them into fruition. Like, just to get super hippy dippy, I think that we are all just extensions of God. We're all God pretending to be human. And if the G word scares you, you can fill in the blank with whatever you prefer, like the collective consciousness of all that is. But and to your point also, Dr. Nicole, if your past is filled with trauma and that onion has lots of physical and emotional blocks in it, then that autonomic nervous system, that amygdala, that fear-based center is going to take over and try and protect you, so that you won't even be able to act in accordance with your dreams. You won't even believe that you deserve your dreams. So until you heal that past, it's almost like you're incapable of those future desires really guiding you. Because yeah, you might want to write the book, but you're like, well, nobody cares about what I say because my dad said I was dumb my whole life. But as you heal that inner child work, which you're so gifted at, Dr. Nicole, it's like, then to your point, Dr. Ben, it's like, well, then we become more able to allow those desires, to that horse, to move us elegantly and effortlessly and frictionlessly to that future version of ourselves. But it's almost like that ratio is moving back and forth. And the degree to which we've healed the past is the degree to which we can move towards our future self. So it's like a constantly changing ratio.
One quick just thought about that is that there's a kind of a framework for all goal orientations. Either goals are considered approach oriented, where it's a goal you want, or it's a goal that's an avoid goal, where it's something you don't want to happen. And usually what occurs when a person has unresolved trauma, and 100% like that heavily impacts a person's goals. Usually when a person has unresolved trauma, the future that they're projecting is a future that they're avoiding, and we all have futures we're avoiding. Like I may, a lot of my goals are to avoid certain things from happening. But generally it's a lot healthier to have promotion-based goals than prevention-based goals. And so even if a person has unresolved trauma, they're still actually from my standpoint, they're still being driven by their future, but it's actually a future they're generally avoiding. They're trying to avoid things from happening because they're still stuck in fear. But you're right. I love the quote, and this is actually a Dan quote. He said, to have a bigger future, you must have a better past. And obviously the past is, just as flexible as the future. The past is pretty much your current self's perspective of the past, because the past is always reconstructed in the present. So whatever view you have of the past is really just your current self's perspective. If your current self goes through a different perspective, you're gonna reconstruct a different version of your past. And so you can definitely get much better at framing past experiences as positives or as post-traumatic growth. And yes, certainly the more you do that, you can then develop a much bigger, more confident future.
Okay, I want to talk about. Oh, sorry.
Just add something too. I think it's really important to acknowledge too, because sometimes I get asked, do you have to go back to the past, revisit it, open these old wounds, talk to maybe these relationships that caused harm? And ultimately the past is available right here, right now, because most of us in some way or another are bringing it in that subconscious way. So anyone who might be having that question themselves, it's not about necessarily revisiting. It's about looking at all of the different ways that the past is showing up, maybe to speak to your point, by constantly worrying about avoiding, right? That kind of fear threat based, actually coming from, like you're saying, Emily, that activated nervous system. And what are we looking to avoid? The things that hurt us in the past. So to heal the past, again, begins in that consciousness by being present to what's here now. It's not about going in a hypnosis session or speaking to people that might have caused harm, because chances are the past is present in some way now, and you can begin to create that new future from right where you stand.
Back to the horse example. I believe the goals we set or dreams we feel we have are often connected to what our consciousness or our experience tells us is possible. And we don't have access yet to bigger goals because we don't have the environment to realize it's possible. I look back at my own path, and again, how I am here right now in terms of everything we've created is because I've surrounded myself with people who dream even bigger than me, which some people might think is insane, but it's true along the way. And it's those experiences that have shaped my possibility of what's the potential or possible in terms of goal setting, but more around belief. I actually wore this shirt for two reasons. One, because I love Ted Lasso and I love that show, but around the idea of believing. And I think part of my work and our team in the Archangel community is to connect people here with giant dreamers so that you can see what's possible. Like, how would you know a goal is achievable unless you see someone else do it first, or you're made aware of what's possible? It's that sort of Roger Bannister 4-Minute Mile story of how no one thought it was humanly possible to run a mile in 4 minutes. And then he did it. And then right after he did it, another 50 people did it right away because they saw him do it. So how do we then break free of our current environment to see what's possible, to build future, to dream at a bigger level, and then make sure we have the roadmap to get to that place? This is something I'm constantly trying to think about to support people in this community, because when you're here, you're someone who cares about helping other people, and you're only limited by your belief structure. So how do we help expand belief?
I'll let ladies go. I'm happy to share, but whoever wants to go ahead first.
I have a thought too, because I just wanted to acknowledge, I think, Giovanni, the difference between external environment, the people I'm around, the opportunities, the talks that I might have, or the books that I might be exposed to, and our internal environment. So what I've seen in my own journey, especially early on, as I started to read all different types of literature about the human body, about the power of belief. Bruce Lipton comes to mind, really integral in beginning to shift my belief system, because I came from not only a family, but a field that very much taught personality is fixed. Our brain is fixed. It wasn't until more recently that we even discovered in the psychology field that our brain is actually not fixed. It's plastic. It can change. So, and I saw very much evidence of limiting beliefs. I can't change because was a mantra of mine. And so when I kind of am differentiating between external environment, internal, what I saw in myself was I was consuming a lot of powerful stories, reading about a lot of people who changed their lives, medically, emotionally, transformationally. And yet there was a little belief in my head that was grounded in all of my past experiences, personal and professional, that was, I joke, I say, rolling its eyes. And I kept limiting myself by reading about people who have done the things that I might want to do for myself, and separating, saying, well, they can do that because, and whatever reason I gave, to make sense of why they could and I can't. So I think when we really talk about changing beliefs, as important as external environment is, having the exposure, one of the reasons why I keep all of my online content now free is for that reason, to give this content, to provide this information to people who might not have it. Though the work for a lot of us who even have or exposed to this life-changing, belief-changing information is more internal, shifting that idea from I can't, or this won't work for me, or I'm not worthy of, to I can.
I would liken it to,
go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, like software and hardware. Like there's no shortage of software in the world. Like we are living in the information age.
Yeah.
You want to find out anything, like you can, it's out there. And the trick is that if you're trying to run a really fancy operating system, you know, the fanciest Mac OS, Snow Leopard, Mountain Lion, Yosemite, whatever it is these days, you try and run that on a stressed out PC from 1995, it just doesn't work. And it actually stresses it out more and can sometimes make it like fall apart. And so what I'm really into, and I feel like my role to play in this consciousness evolution dance that we're all in, is giving people the tools to defrag their brain computer, to up-level the actual machine, to get rid of the stress that we all have in our nervous systems, which is keeping us small. It's keeping us in fear. It's keeping in those limited stories. And if you do the work of every single day, systematically getting rid of the entire backlog of stresses accumulated in your nervous system, which includes those stories, those traumas, the physical stuff, it's like you're just expanding so that you have this computer, you have this hardware that can run whatever software you choose. And then you get to use those adages and those cliches of like, well, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Or everything seems unsolvable until you solve it, right? It's like, those are nice isms, but until you have a machine that can run that software, it's going to seem like what you were saying, Dr. Nicole, well, that's true for everybody else. But like, yeah, meditation is cool for everybody else, but my stress is special. Everyone else can meditate, but my brain is too crazy. And so it's until you start to get rid of that stuff that you can even sort of know what your dreams are. Like I would call this dream work manifesting. And the number one block I hear for people is like, I don't know what I want. And this is probably not true of this community, right? Like this is a community of dreamers by definition. But that might be maybe a non-obvious gift that we could all share with our greater communities is, how did you find out? How did you even get the clarity to know what your dream is? Because a lot of people don't know, or a lot of people do, and they're afraid to admit it.
I think we all have the dream muscle and we haven't been flexing. And I think that what you just said of people not knowing what they want or desire is very much true even for all of us, because I don't think we've ever thought about it, or sometimes in the past we haven't been given permission to dream in that way. And I want to circle back to Emily in a second about how do we figure that out? How do we get the clarity of what we want? And then how do we believe we deserve what we want? So we'll come back to that's my open loop. I want to get back to Ben, who wanted to add into what you were saying.
Awesome. Love your next question. Excited for where people go on that. I'll just share 3 quick thoughts as far as how to, if I remember the prior question, it was expand or make bigger what you want, kind of going back to the idea of the horse. We're all driven by a horse. The current horse that's driving you is different from the one 3 weeks ago or 3 years ago. I do agree. So there's a concept in psychology. I'll give three quick ideas. One is Pygmalion effect in psychology, that we're always adapting to the norms of those around us. And so certainly by putting yourself around new people and in new situations, it normalizes it normalizes what is possible. And I've definitely seen that. And I know just through my own experience that I can proactively put myself around new people. And by doing so, it does normalize new potentials, whether it's the amount of money I make, whether it's just, it could really be anything. So one is just the idea of the Pygmalion effect, that you really do adapt to and adjust to the norms of those around you. The next one is kind of an Albert Einstein quote. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And so I think one aspect of just making your goals bigger is actually testing imagination. This is another thing that Daniel Gilbert talked about, who has studied future self for a long time. He said that generally the problem with people's future self is that they imagine their future self to essentially be the same person as their current self. And so it's essentially a fixed mindset. They aren't imagining a much different life. And from his standpoint, it's just people's lack of imagination. That's the fundamental problem. And so I think actually testing imagination, actually pretending or seeing yourself in a different situation as you want it to be, or even just testing different future scenarios, actually getting in your journal and actually thinking, what would it look like if I was either 10 times better or 10 times bigger in a certain area, actually sitting with it. The third one is like the Gap and the Gain, which Dan and I wrote. And I share this because I think it's very useful. Basically what the gap, and I won't go into the whole concept, but basically being in the gain is where you regularly reference where your past self was, and you recognize how different your current self is from your past self. Like I can sit in my journal and I can analyze my thinking versus my thinking a week ago. And I can say, how do I think, how is my thinking different from how my thinking was a week ago? And as I'm regularly, and I do this regularly, I'm regularly referencing back to my past self and recognizing a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, how different I am from my past self. And by regularly referencing how different I am right now, I recognize how fluid my current self is, and how much I have grown and changed even in a week. And by referencing the differences, it creates an immediate growth mindset. It allows you to immediately realize you can do more. You can change. Your future self will be different. So it does eliminate the fixed mindset.
I love that. I think that's so cool. And I think that's a beautiful segue into your other question, Giovanni. Like, it seems like, Dr. Ben, you're continually celebrating your successes, and maybe they've changed in a way that you want to celebrate, and maybe they haven't, but even acknowledging the plasticity, even acknowledging the change is setting yourself up for future change. And I love the quote, my friend Dallas Travers says that you cannot build on top of success you don't acknowledge. And because we as a species are so good at worshiping our non-possessions, we're so good at worshiping our non-achievements. So we're constantly thinking about everything we have yet to manifest. And so when I teach manifesting, which I think answers both of your questions, Gio, which is, how do we know what we want? And then how do we believe that we deserve what we want? Those are two really key elements to manifesting. And to start, I would define manifesting as consciously creating a life you love. It's you getting intentional about what that horse even is. What are my goals versus being on autopilot? And that sounds really simple, to ask yourself the question, what would I love right now? But not that many people are doing it. The question that people are mostly asking themselves are like, well, why? What's the problem? What's the danger? Why can't I have it? How much is it going to cost? What's going to go on Instagram? What's going to please my mom? We don't ask the question, what would I love right now? And what I teach is that people do that right after the meditation, right? Where the right and left hemispheres of the brain are functioning in unison, where they've accessed that source energy, where they've flooded their brain and body with dopamine and serotonin. So they're feeling good. And then the prerequisite to asking that question is first gratitude, because gratitude is doing something similar to what you just mentioned, Ben, where you are acknowledging everything that you have already manifested. Gratitude is saying thank you for everything you have already co-created with nature. Again, ridiculously simple, but not that many people are doing it. You might have a gratitude journal that you do by rote, really getting into a feeling space of enthusiastic gratitude for what is a very small click away for enthusiastic gratitude for what is on the way. And, the big trick and secret about manifesting is that it's about getting into the feeling space as if the dream is happening now. It's a different kind of plasticity where you're putting yourself into your future self and celebrating what is, but from the POV of your future self. And so to me, there's a two-step process, simply asking the question, what would I love right now? And to me, that vernacular matters. When you ask, what would I love? It puts you into spirit. It puts you into possibility. What would I love now? Puts you into present moment. Not what did I write in my high school yearbook 20 years ago, but like, how is nature trying to use me now? And then how do we believe that we deserve it? That's where the mastery comes in. And that's where it sometimes takes the work of clearing that trauma, healing the past stories and belief, getting rid of the stress stored in the nervous system. Because the tricky thing about manifesting is that we don't get what we want in life. We get what we believe we deserve. And oftentimes it's that 90 to 95% of the subconscious or those even unrecognized beliefs that are steering the ship. And so my goal is to get a higher percentage of people's consciousness actually aware of what those desires are and doing it from a place of feeling really good versus a place of fear and stress and trauma.
So good. We've covered future a bit. I want to cover the past. I don't know if I've ever, Martin, shared my, origin stories about why we named this show The Gifted Show. So I'll do it super quick. And I have a question for Ben on the word gifted. So I'm preempting you, Ben. When I was in 5th grade, the schools were doing IQ testing. I scored super high. And because of it, they labeled me gifted. And once a week, I would go to a different school for gifted class to be around other gifted kids. And then when I came back to my regular school, I would be bullied, made fun of, picked on. And I had a trauma with the word gifted. I hated it. because it made me stand out. And I didn't understand, like, why am I being made fun of for being myself? Until high school, when I started reading comic books. And, back, this is the early 90s, when if you read comics, you were a nerd, and those words were bad, like geek, nerd. So I had to read them in secret. And my very first X-Men said Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. And it meant superpower, and it changed my life. And back then in high school, I said, when I grow up, I want to lead a team of superheroes. And now I've done that. And to me, I believe we are all gifted, meaning we all have a gift to share with other people. And that's why this show exists. Now, to Ben, in your new book, Be Your Future Self Now, you tell a story about a study or an experiment that was done with second and third grade teachers who were told which of their students were gifted, but they weren't. It was just a test. Can you talk about that study?
Yeah, that study is actually basically an evidence of the Pygmalion effect, which I was just describing. But so yeah, this was, I think this study was back in like the 80s. But basically, there were two researchers who were collaborating with some second and third grade teachers, and they basically wanted to study these classes for the full year and just see how the students developed throughout the full year. And so what they did at the beginning of the year was they gave IQ tests to the students and basically just categorized them into one of two categories: gifted students, non-gifted students. And they told the teachers pre the year, like preschool year, like which ones were which. And they just wanted to see if, the gifted students would develop faster. And that is essentially what happened. The gifted students did learn a lot more, got a lot more out of it. But kind of the twist to the study is that at the end of the year, and the teachers didn't actually know this, that the professors never actually gave IQ tests at the beginning of the year. They just randomly assigned the students into gifted and non-gifted. And so they told the teachers which ones were gifted and non-gifted, and the teachers treated the students differently, and it was totally subconscious. Some of it might've been conscious, but they did expect more of the students that they perceived to be gifted. And those students did perform enormously better than the non-gifted students, even though, like, from an IQ standpoint, there was no difference. It was total random assignment. And so it is interesting that the expectations of those around us often do shape us, especially as kids. As you get older, you can start to separate that, but it's still a large impact on who we are. As kids, massively, and as someone who has a lot of kids, I have to catch myself, because I know that I have expectations of my kids and that those expectations are different from kid to kid to kid. And I'm fine with that. They're different people, but I also am weary of overly shaping their direction by my expectations.
So I did that experiment myself in high school. Let me share quickly. Grade 12 chemistry, I was fourth period. And then fifth period, as we were leaving the room, another group of grade 12 students were coming in to take the exact same class. So whenever we had a test or a quiz, as we were leaving the room, the students coming in would say, "Hey, what's on the test? How was the test? Was it easy? Was it hard?" So for fun, I started experimenting, and I would take 3 or 4 people and say, "That was the easiest test I've ever done." And then 3 or 4 people and say, "Oh man, that was challenging." And 100% of the time, the people I told it was easy did better than the other ones. And it was always randomized. I've been a scientist my whole life. And I thought, this is so powerful that when you tell someone, like, this is going to be easy, it probably completely changed their physical state, puts them more into parasympathetics, and they will do better because they have the belief. And I think that's for all of us here. We're probably doing that to ourselves all the time, telling ourselves something is going to be hard, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I want to going back
By the
to
way, just real quick, a really brilliant book on the subject is Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, all about setting the context, and that whatever context you set is going to shape kind of the pathway you go down. But anyways, keep going.
So I find tremendous value in the trauma and the pain I've been through, because it unleashed my superpowers, where I felt like I never belonged and I never fit in and I stood out. So I created a community of people that could fit in, which is what this entire Archangel thing is. However, or maybe my question for Nicole is, because you help people heal trauma, past traumas, doing inner child work. Can you explain what inner child means? And I think my question is, after that, is the intention to heal stuff that's happened in the past, or use it as a superpower?
Yes, absolutely. So this conversation really is an extension of, right, this idea that our past impacts our present. All of these different messaging. So in this example of this experiment, right, the teachers had an unconscious and were sending, whether it was direct or indirect messages to these different groups of students that impacted their behavior. Well, all of those different direct and indirect messages are happening originally, in our earliest environment, in our family homes. There are messages that are communicated that, again, like I shared earlier, we're attuned to and we're absorbing and we're figuring out the way to fit in. So if our natural self-expression back when we were a child, right, to be artistic, to be quote unquote loud or too dramatic or emotional or whatever it is, if that was received negatively, and again, it doesn't even have to be direct where we were told no, not to. Sometimes it's just an indirect, right? Mom leaves the room when we're doing whatever it is that we're doing that mom's not comfortable around. The more consistently that happens, the more, right, we're adapting and modifying who we are to fit into this world. And then we continue to do that throughout life. So when we talk about healing our inner child, what I describe our inner child is, it's that space in our mind that exists within all of us that originally, right, when we're first born, has access to, here's words we've already used, to our creativity, our imagination, our self-expression, is free to just be the essence or the entity that they are, the being that they are as a child, right? And again, the more we modify that state, the more we're not accessing, quite literally, Emily, like you're describing it, a state of consciousness. So the goal really is first to become witness to what is the impact of that conditioning? How much am I modifying myself? Do I not even know, like we were just discussing, who that self is? Is there so much trauma in my body that I don't feel safe enough to imagine even a future? Because that's how dysregulation in our nervous system impacts us. Some of us might not at a time, passion, purpose. There were words I read in a book. I never would have been able to say I'm a passionate, purposeful person. I didn't know what my purpose was at all. I didn't relate to those words because I was so stuck in survival mode. When you're trying to survive, passion, purpose, imagination, that's not a priority at all. So the inner child is, again, all of that unconscious, computer system that still lives inside each of us, that feels less than, that feels worthy, that's modifying who we are, that's maybe so dysregulated, we can't even connect with that space. So again, the work isn't revisiting the things that hurt us. The work is reconnecting with that inner space now, learning how to regulate my nervous system so that I can even begin to imagine a future that's different from the repetition of the past that I'm currently living. Because that's the thing about our thoughts as well. If we're present to our thoughts, we are having them all day long. And a lot of times they're very repetitive. They're based in the same past. They're not actually, again, Emily, to use your point, consciously creating a new, because we're just repeating narratives, stories, feelings that we once lived. So they're not invalid. They're very much a part of our experience, though to heal is to integrate, to see all of that hurt, all of that pain. And like you said, to relax into it, to allow it to be there while I'm still conscious. And when I'm still conscious, I now get to make possibly new choices that allow me again to imagine a future that's different. And this is why I'm so impassioned. And I call myself a holistic psychologist, because in my opinion, at least, very little of this process is possible if my body is so dysregulated, because it will impact our imagination. It will impact our connection to ourselves, and it will continue to contribute to that cyclical nature that many of us are repeating.
I think we need to loop Emily in on how to do what I've heard you describe as mental hygiene. And part of that is because, well, I mean, look at the title of your book, Stress Less, Accomplish More. It's very challenging to be creative if you're in that state of sympathetics and stress and fight or flight, because you're way more worried about maintaining safety or running away from what might be attacking you, even if that attack is a boss you don't like or something like that. So what is your recommendation of shifting back into creativity, back into, maybe explain sympathetics and parasympathetics, but just so people understand how to get to that place where you can then dream again?
Yeah. So the harsh reality here is that stress is making us all stupid, sick, and slow. And especially with high performers and entrepreneurs, like, I need my stress. That's the thing that gives me my competitive edge. It's like, nope, it's making you stupid. If you can run a 4-minute mile with a rock in your shoe, try taking the rock out of your shoe. Like, getting rid of your stress is not going to make you not competitive. It's just going to allow you to move towards your dreams instead of away from the trauma. And you actually become more effective, more productive. And guess what? It's sustainable. So stress is a tricky word, because just like the word meditation, it's become so ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And there's good stress and bad stress. There's hormesis, which is where you do like a cold plunge or a sauna, and that's really good. It like wakes up and strengthens your strong mitochondria and it kills the weak ones. And it's important to put our bodies under like that good stress from time to time. The tricky one is the chronic stress, that low grade fight or flight, eating food that isn't food, not having enough sex, not being in nature, looking at screens all day, not getting good sleep. Like, this is this low grade chronic stress that is in fact making us stupid, sick, and slow. And so I basically dedicated my entire life to giving people tools to get out of this fight or flight, because right now we're facing really big challenges as a species. And we are going to need all hands on deck, and we're going to need us all firing on all cylinders if we want to be up for the challenge of solving just climate change. Forget about any of the other challenges that we're facing as a species. So to do that, to get us not stupid, sick, and slow, to get us fast and healthy and smart, we have to get rid of the stress. And the fastest tool I've found that is a very specific style of meditation. And just a quick show of hands, who here has tried meditation and felt frustrated because you could not clear your mind? Just be honest. Okay. Like, I want to meditate, but I've got too many thoughts. Okay. I'm scrolling through, I'm seeing lots of nods and hands. Okay. You're not alone. You're not a meditation failure. You likely just haven't been taught yet. Okay. The thing about meditation is that it's not about clearing your mind. The mind thinks involuntarily, just like the heart beats involuntarily. So trying to give your brain a command to shut up is as impactful as trying to give your heart a command to stop beating. It does not work. And this is why the whole world thinks that meditation is hard. It is in fact a skill, right? And just because it's simple doesn't mean that it's weak. And just like you wouldn't expect yourself to do a 20-minute Japanese challenge without ever having learned the language of Japanese, why would you ever expect yourself to do a 20-day meditation challenge if you have not learned a skill of meditation? And so the style that I teach, the Ziva technique, is mindfulness, meditation, and manifesting. But the specific meditation style is based on something that's 6,000 years old, and it's called Nishkam Karma Yoga, which means union attained by action hardly taken, lazy meditation. Okay, now this is great, because if you like napping, you're going to love this style of meditation. It looks kind of like this. Like, this is great posture for us. It does not look good on Instagram, but it feels amazing. And you're giving your body rest that's 5 times deeper than sleep. And that's a really important point, because when you give your body the rest that it needs, it knows how to heal itself. And the cool part here is that with this style, you're not just healing the stress from today. You're not just like, well, my boss yelled at me, let me do 10 minutes of my free app, I feel better. And then now it's not a state change. When you de-excite your nervous system this dramatically, when you give your body this type of deep healing rest, you actually heal the stress from your past. And this is, to Dr. Nicole's point, our stress is not just in the now and it's gone. Every time you've ever launched into fight or flight, it's left an open window on your brain machine. And by the time the average adult is 20 years old, we have about 10 million of those open windows on our brain computer. And that's the thing that slows us down. So I'm just interested in giving you tools to rest. You can close down those windows so that you have your entire computing power for the task at hand. The style that I teach, you don't have to focus, you don't have to concentrate, you don't have to clear your mind, you don't need fancy fingers, you don't need expensive Lululemon pants, you just need a place to sit and a little bit of training. And it's way simpler than it sounds. What's one thing I could give you right now that would be helpful that you could use right away? I would say, I don't want to try and weaken the practice. I don't want to try and simplify the practice beyond what it needs, because it is a skill. But I would say that like the simplest thing you could do right now, if you're having anxiety, if you're feeling overwhelmed, you feel like you're about to make a rash decision, the simplest thing is just something called the 2X breath, where you inhale through your nose for 2 and you exhale out of your mouth for 4. And it's just a 2X breath because you're doubling the length of the exhale from the inhale. It's ridiculously simple, but you're softening and strengthening that vagus nerve, which is the superhighway between your brain and body. And if you're about to have a panic attack, you don't have time for fancy visualizations. It's just, and you could even do it walking if you're really stressed out, in for 2, out for 4, in for 2, out for 4. And then, if you want to learn more, let's dive in. I'd love to share these tools with you.
I love that. And I have a trainer who comes to my house a few times a week, a personal trainer. His name is Igor. I'll give him a shout out.
Of course, your trainer's name is Igor.
He's amazing. And, I wear a heart rate monitor, and we're always testing recovery. And he actually taught me that type of breathing you can slow your heart rate down super fast if you inhale quickly and exhale a lot slower. I want to, I had another flash of something that I've been through. I almost forgot, and I want to give her credit. So I worked with a coach back in that 2011 time. Her name is Joanne Delcor, who's local in Toronto here. She's amazing. And she's probably the first person who taught me the idea of future self. So I was in her place, in her office. She had a couch. I laid down. She said, close your eyes and imagine yourself way in the future, 30, 40 years. What do you look like? And I developed an avatar for my future self. And at the time I had a lot more hair. So I said, future me is going to have like a shaved head. And future me looks like me today, which is kind of cool. But the person I envisioned, a decade ago. And she said, when you're stuck, and name him different than your name. So I called him Johnny Angel, which is my DJ name from when I was throwing parties a long time ago, because I just love the name. And she said, have conversations with Johnny Angel when you're stuck and let him guide you. And that's been transformative. And Ben, in your new book, you actually talk about this concept that to become your future self, you have to fall in love with your future self as a different entity than you. And how can you talk about this in terms of creating the avatar of future you and making them different than who you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. And just wanted to say, I love what Emily was saying and really all the comments, but I agree so much about reducing stress, clearing as much of the noise as possible so that, so much research about how happiness is really a fundamental to peak performance. And so I love that. I think that it's really important to recognize, and we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, that your future self already is a different person than your current self. And that it's actually not only unhealthy, I guess you could say, to think that they're the exact same person in you as always, because they're going to have different perspectives. They're going to have gone through experiences. They'll have different contexts, different goals. And so it's bad for imagination, I guess you could say, to think that your future self is the exact same person you are today. But it's also just radically inaccurate. Like it's like thinking that you're the exact same person in all of your views, beliefs, and behaviors as you were 10 years ago. It's just not true. Like you're a very different person than you were 10 years ago. And so I guess the first step is just very much appreciating this fact. And there's a lot of good research on this. Dr. Hal Hirschfield at UCLA, he spent a lot of time studying this. And like a really healthy first step is just recognizing that your future self is very different than you. That's a first step to starting to think about how your decisions now impact that different person. They are a different person. And so what Dr. Hirschfield talks about, and I like this idea, is developing empathy for your future self, recognizing that they have different perspectives than you, that they have different cares than you do. And so if you start to develop empathy for your future self, you start to recognize they actually are different. You start to want to connect with them and start to think about what matters to them. What do they care about? Start putting yourself into their context. And then you can start to get a little bit more vivid about your future self, which is where you can start to develop a friendship with your future self. But I think the first step is just recognizing they are a different person. They have different cares. And then if you want, obviously it's up to you. You can start to, as you did, Gio, start to think about like, how different are they? In what ways are they different? What skills do they have? What's their context like? How do they handle things? So I think there's the first step is just embracing the idea that they are very different and that they see things different, they care about different things. And then you can start to, using the imagination, start to actually think about what are some of those differences you want to see? What are some of the ways in which they are different? And kind of going back to the idea of growth mindset, and just an invitation for all of you to recognize and appreciate how different you are from your former self. Your future self can have totally different skill sets, different mental models, different beliefs. Like just because you may not know Spanish now, or like some language, like your future self may have that. Just because your current self isn't really good at X skill, your future self can be really brilliant at that. You may not be great with money. They may be excellent with money. My past self was not a good writer. And actually there's a lot of research that shows, that deliberate practice, which is really just systematic learning, in order to actually engage in deliberate practice, you really need a clear view of your future self. Like that's why they call it deliberate. So you have to be deliberate about what you want to learn. But the amazing part about human beings is how much we actually can transform and develop. And so I think just starting to get intentional and thoughtful about, first off, how different, but in what directions you want that difference, so that then you can start deliberately practicing. How I look at it, and it really fits with exactly what Dr. Nicole was saying, is I look at current self as your habits. And that's kind of like your current personality. Habits are current self. That's you on autopilot. Whereas deliberate practice is your future self. And that's where you start stepping out of your current self, start testing new things, start failing, start learning, start getting new perspectives. So deliberate practice is really how you become your future self. If you want to stay at your current self, you can just stick with habits.
So to get to that place, Nicole, you probably need to get out of your comfort zone. And I have a philosophy for myself that the opposite of that is your discomfort zone, and that's where growth happens. And we have to be comfortable with our discomfort zone. So I'm curious how you teach clients to step out cautiously, carefully, lovingly out of their comfort zone so that they can experience that kind of growth.
I think something to acknowledge, like you're saying, is that as humans, quite universally, we don't like change. Change is naturally uncomfortable. That's why our autopilot is wired to repeat that past, because according to our subconscious mind, the past is predictable. The uncertain future isn't. And there's safety in knowing what comes next. So we don't like to do something new because the outcome is unknown. And now we're in that space of possible anxiety. So we avoid that at all costs. And I love what you're saying, Dr. Hardy, and going back to a concept we talked about earlier in terms of getting out of our comfort zone in the now, and shifting into that growth mindset. And like you're describing, for me, that begins with creating space for the new. Like we've been talking about all along, right? Shifting out of the past, being present to what is here, and being present in the space of new possibilities. So whether that means even acknowledging for ourselves, our progress, how I'm different in this exact moment than I was in past moments. And we can also extend that, because what I see in myself is how often we limit other people too, just like we limit ourselves. How often we go to our partners, to our friends, to our loved ones, and anticipate what they're going to say or what they're going to do or how they're going to feel based on what was once the case for them, even if they themselves have shown growth, have shown change, have been doing things differently. Again, from that same desire for the familiar, we paint our loved ones into that same past that we keep ourselves stuck in. So for me, it's finding the space to hold for myself, for another, to show up in a growth-based mindset, to show up. And that begins with first just to show up to what is, not what was. And again, like I said, for me, I see instances of me painting myself into the past, not necessarily acknowledging all of the ways that I'm different. And I see myself doing that sometimes to my loved ones. So the more empathetic, compassionate we can be, creating that space for a new self in the moment and gifting that to the loved ones around us, that, in my opinion, becomes that practical practice of living into the future.
Real quick, G, I just wanted to say, I think that's so cool, and it fits with exactly with everything you've said before about consciousness. Because I think a simple definition of mindfulness is really noticing change, whether it's in yourself, others, in context. Like if you're not seeing change, it's because you're not being mindful, right? You're just assuming the blinders or the biases of your past. So if I'm looking at my kids, for example, and I keep thinking that they're the same person they were last week or last month, I'm not mindful of the changes. And so I think it fits really beautifully with everything, everyone's been saying about consciousness, and essentially mindfulness is the same thing, which is awareness of change as it's occurred in real time, so that you can actually see that things aren't the same as they were 5 minutes ago.
Brilliant. On my own journey, I think one of the biggest challenges I've had around this kind of transformation is that when a feeling would start bubbling up that reminded me of past pain that I've been through, I would do everything in my power to avoid that scenario instead of allow the feeling to happen and realize it's not connected to that scenario. And Emily, why are we so afraid to feel our feelings?
Well, because we've been trained since infancy to not do it. Shh, don't cry, have a bottle. Shh, don't cry, have a toy. Shh, don't cry, have an iPad. Shh, don't cry, have some Facebook, have some pills, have some wine, have some pot, have some SSRIs, but do not feel. There are billions of dollars of industry built on top of ensuring that you never have to feel a feeling. And then what we've done is we've spent decades being like, I'm fine. I'm fine. There's been a pandemic and a world war and global warming, but I'm fine. And then we're just like, I can't even put like one toe inside of the tsunami of feelings that are inside of me, because if I even crack that surface, I think I'm going to break down. I'm going to lose it. And I'm fond of saying, like, nothing breaks inside of you when you cry. You don't lose anything except for some toxins out of your eyeballs. And then guess what? You get flooded with bliss chemistry right behind it. And so it's like, we're all just constipated with feelings, and we don't have, there's nowhere in our archetype, certainly not for, and not to be like, it doesn't even matter. Like, for depending on the gender, that's trickier, where it's like, well, with some genders, you can not have rage as an archetype, and some you can't have grief as an archetype. And I think that we have to, because we've been entrained in this for so long, and because many of us have experienced such different levels of trauma, we've grown really good at protection. And if the status quo and if survival is your goal, then protection is a fine MO. But if you actually want to grow and evolve and heal and contribute, then we're going to have to be brave enough to feel our feelings. And I find that with the meditation, it's like it just takes down the baseline. Like, you get out of a 9.5, you drop yourself to like a 2 or a 3. And then if you get up to a 7 or an 8, yeah, you have a good ugly cry and then you feel better. Versus like, if you're at a 9, you can't afford to feel your feelings because it's going to take you into like a dangerous zone. So it's just like with inflammation. If you're at a 9.9 of inflammation, you eat one piece of gluten, you're in trouble. You take your baseline level of inflammation down, you can afford to eat a cake once a year on your birthday or whatever. So it's like, we got to just take our baseline levels of stress down so we're not constantly redlining. And then once we do that, then it's not quite as scary to feel our feelings. I am currently living with an amazing woman named Regina Thomashower, AKA known as Mama Gina. And she's developed this technique called swamping, which is basically physicalizing your rage and physicalizing your grief. And then you sprinkle turn on into it. You actually use your sexual energy. You use your pleasure to transmute that grief and rage into like a clean energy source. And in 3 songs, you can take yourself from being like an apathetic, depressive mess to like, oh, I have spaciousness in my body because I actually just allowed myself to move that rage and grief that I've been sitting on for 4 decades.
I need you to expand a bit on this. And Stephanie, my partner, is attending right now, and she has to interview you on this whole topic in terms of where you're going right now. Can you share what you're working on? And Steph, please book a call with Emily to interview for your show.
Yeah, like husbands across the world are like, hey, can my wife interview you? So I've recently outed myself as a sex witch, which to me simply means someone who's using this superpower that we all have, which is our most creative force, which is our sexual energy. Like one way that we can use sexual energy is to create a human. But every time you go into a peak pleasure state, every time you go into an orgasmic state, something is created, something is birthed. And so your electromagnetic field gets bigger, your magnet gets stronger when you were in those states. And so I'm conflating two topics. One is called swamping, which is what I led with, which is a physicalization, a purging technique, where you're physicalizing your rage and your grief and then sprinkling just a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of turn on into it to transmute like that dirty energy of grief and rage into clean energy. Which is beautiful. Check out Mama Regina Thomas-Schauer. She's amazing. And then this other piece is basically sacred sexuality. And instead of thinking of your sexual energy as bad or wrong or shameful or dirty or taking you away from the holy, away from the divine, there really can be such a reclamation of like, wait, my desires are divinely inspired. My pleasure is in fact holy. That for thousands of years, ecstasy was seen as a purifying force to bring you closer to God. Right. And what do we say about God? Like God, the creator. And if our sexual energy is creative energy, then when we start to wake that up inside of ourselves, it increases what we're able to do in the world. And so it folds into this conversation beautifully because so many people have sexual trauma. So many people have been introduced to it into a way that feels not them or not, it doesn't feel like a fit. So there's so much room for growth and so much room for healing in this area.
Thank you. And half an hour ago, Ben said a phrase and just kind of slipped it in and changed directions. And I want to go right back to this phrase. And I'm actually going to ask Nicole about it first and have Ben add. And the phrase was post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
And,
so good.
You know, we've all heard of PTSD. What is post-traumatic growth? So we'll start with Nicole and then back to Ben.
I think this is a great question to even come on the heels of this conversation about from sexuality to just even more expansively, our emotions in general and stress and how all this connects. And so the large reason, right, why many of us aren't facing our emotions, and there's a point I'm going back to this, is because we felt overwhelmed by them. We didn't have the support. And there's a deep belief that they will consume us, that we'll become reactive. So we avoid, we suppress, we stay away from them. What happens then as a byproduct is we avoid, suppress, or stay away from our emotions, and we never develop resilience. And what resilience is the ability to become stressed and then to become unstressed, to keep it really, really simple. So we have to learn that confidence within our emotions. And when we've experienced trauma, when we've had access to the depths of whatever pain that came around with it, if we're not tending to it, doesn't mean that those emotions aren't there. Like we've been talking about throughout this whole workshop, they're there. They're being manifest in our dysregulated nervous system, our beliefs, our habits and patterns, our personality. We become the trauma in all of those ways. We become the emotions in all of those ways. So what post-traumatic growth is all of the outcomes that come from living through those experiences, which for a lot of us is the ability to be very expansive in our emotional bandwidth, because our emotions, and the reason why I brought those up is they're signals from our environment. We actually quite need them. We need to know when something is violating us and we feel angry or hurt, because that's back to this concept in the beginning. That's where our intuition pings us from. It's part of our inner guidance system. So a lot of us who've come through trauma, right, have access to this reservoir of emotions and to the development of resilience. Once, of course, we become conscious that we're living in a dysregulated nervous system, and we begin to slowly and gradually teach our body how to deal with more and more stress. Because now what we're doing, every time we went around the stress, we avoided it, we numbed or we checked out. For me, I lived on a spaceship for 25 years of my life, avoiding my feelings, all sending myself a subconscious message that I needed to do that because I was overwhelmed by those feelings and I have to avoid them. Little by little, the more I allowed and managed my stress and learned how to tolerate and allowed my body to become a little bit stressed and then fall back into safety, now I'm developing a confidence, a belief that I can handle, feel my feelings and allow them to help me navigate through life. So what post-traumatic growth offers a lot of us then is that emotional resilience, though in the interim, we do have to learn how to consciously regulate our body, because then we're going to go back to the concept we talked about earlier. And Emily, I think you said it, life in reactivity, because those emotions are going to call the shots. And likely that's all of those reactive patterns that most of us are cycling through daily. And when we develop that resilience, a lot of the times what we're developing is that post-traumatic growth, the growth and expansion that comes when we've met these feelings of ourselves.
Mm. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Gio, you want me to share some thoughts?
Yes, please.
Beautiful. Yeah, I kind of look at it, post-traumatic growth as a spectrum. It's not like you either have it or you don't. You can have a lot of growth from a trauma, or you can have a very little amount of growth from a trauma. All growth is good, but you can actually get an extreme amount of growth from a trauma, or you can get very little out of it. And it has a lot to do with how much value you get in the experience. So like, as an example, if you've had a really tough event happen, and you devalue that experience as bad, you give it a label, you avoid it, you feel like it's a valueless experience and you just wish it had not occurred, then you're not going to get much post-traumatic growth out of it. You're still kind of avoiding it. And I kind of liken that to a disorganized past. It's kind of like having an organized or a disorganized closet. If you have a disorganized past, it means you haven't actually constructed it. You're still kind of avoiding it. And therefore it's, that's kind of the idea of becoming reactive. It's still impacting you subconsciously without you really realizing it, because you haven't transformed it. And so you can have a disorganized or a non-transformed past, which is one that's being avoided, or you can continuously transform any experience into increased value and learning. And I kind of look at it like you can squeeze as much juice out of an experience as you want by increasing the value of that experience. And yes, it is deeply emotional in the moment. It can be very painful in the moment. It feels more like a purging process. I've actually literally gone through this week. It reminds me of the quote, "All progress starts by telling the truth." And sometimes it feels like you're kind of getting hit in the face with karma, but it's really not karma. It's just the consequences of your former selves, perspectives, and actions, which now you can either outgrow or not. So I guess the key, similar to cleaning out the closet, is choosing to learn from the experience. It kind of reminds me of the quote that lessons are repeated until they're learned. And so you can go look at an experience. In psychology, they actually call it deliberate rumination, which is viewing an experience generally through the frame of gratitude and actually genuinely just pulling lessons, pulling value, actually increasing the value, choosing to be grateful that the event occurred. Like, you can know that post-traumatic growth has occurred, and in a lot of ways that the trauma has been resolved, because now no longer are you upset that the event happened, but you're actually glad it happened. You're grateful that it happened. You see value in that it happened. And you believe that your current self is actually further along than your past self was before the event happened. If it's still unresolved, then you actually are still bummed out that the event occurred. You feel like you've gone backwards. And so you kind of have a sense of sunk cost or loss, that you've been cheated a little bit because of that event. But once you take control that you're the actual person who frames your experiences, your experiences don't own you, you own your experience. You get to decide what it means. You get to decide how it's framed. Then you start to become incredibly grateful of what you're going through. You get to really value that this experience happened. You're glad it happened. You feel like you're better off because it happened. It happened for you, not to you, right? And you own your experiences. They don't own you. And you get to just increase the value of it. You get to increase how much refinement you get through this experience. And I know that it's something you can get better at dealing with in real time. Like, obviously, maybe a trauma happened 5 years ago that you may still be being impacted by. And obviously you can go and transform that, increase its value, be glad it happened. Yeah, it takes work, but you can be really grateful that it occurred and know that you're better off because it occurred. But you can get better and better at allowing that transformation to happen as it's happening, so that it doesn't have to extend, they call it a refractory period. Essentially, it doesn't have to keep extending into the past, but you transform it in real time. It's potent, but you're just extremely grateful and valuing that this thing is happening, and you're learning a lot, and you're documenting your learning, which is essentially integration.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
Is that I think that's such a beautiful litmus test of am I genuinely, honestly at a place of gratitude? That trauma that happened, can I see that as a blessing? I think is a beautiful,
Are you glad it happened?
Have you done that refractory work? And the only thing I just want to bring up is just the concept of spiritual bypassing, because I used to really be in this big time where I was like, my coach would be like, you're such an effing Pollyanna. Like, you think that everything is fine. And she would just call me out on it because there's a shadow side to it. And that I was so conflict avoidant that I wouldn't actually sit in it and like be in the uncomfortability. I wouldn't do the post-mortem work of the trauma to get to a genuine place. I would just put the happy face sticker on it. And I've just had to sort of I've had to recalibrate that on myself and be brave enough to sit in the gunk for a minute, mine those lessons, like you were just saying, Ben, and then get to a place of genuine gratitude. And so I just want to highlight, like, I think we all sit on a natural part of that spectrum of like, I tend to wallow, or I tend to get to the spiritual bypass. So I think it's just important to notice where we are on that gauge and calibrate appropriately.
So good.
I have one last question for each of you. Before I ask it, for everyone joining live here, I have a request, which is help me spread the word about this show. If you've loved this experience, this is what the show is, and I want the whole world to know about this show. So please subscribe. Martin will share the YouTube link where you can subscribe to the show. And I'll quickly announce our next event is coming up first Thursday in May, same time. And the theme of that event is the ROI of relationships. And I want to announce for the first time who our guests are in May. Two of my friends who are probably the biggest super connectors in the world. The first one, his name is Joe Polish, runs Genius Network, who is one of the most connected people ever. I probably met Ben through Joe, I think, or somewhere like that. And the other is Steve Sims, who ran a company called The Bluefish, where he could connect you to anything you want in the world. He was a concierge service where he had a client who got married at the Vatican, another client who had Andrea Bocelli sing to him as he proposed to his wife in front of the Statue of David, another client who took a submarine down to see the wreck of the Titanic, and all kinds of stuff in between. He can be connected to anything, and everything is based on building and deepening relationship. That's one of my core values as well. I love being a super connector to awesome humans. So check out that event. The registration link is in the chat. Now I'm going to give a break so my team can edit that out of the recording. And here's my last question. And it's the same question for all three of you, but we'll maybe take turns with Emily first. What is your dream come true for future Emily? So your future self, you know, let's say it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now, what have you created for you to consider future you a dream come true in terms of the impact you're having on people?
Okay, so I just got back from Antarctica. And I had the extreme privilege of being there with climate scientists and activists and change makers and culture shifters, and some real lit up about climate change at the moment, which I have been for a long time. I've donated 10% of Ziva's proceeds to climate organizations for a long time. And it feels like I'm just now, and I know this will change in the future, but it feels like all of the things of my whole life, being a Broadway showgirl, meditation, sex witchery, the climate activism, like it's all coming together in this beautiful stew at the moment. And I've been holding this vision of 80,000 people in a stadium together. And it's like a full concert, lights up, Lizzo, Regina's doing swamping, I'm doing meditation. We are holding a vision for the planet. Like 80,000 people crystal clear on what they want for the planet and the species, the rainforests regenerating, the coral reefs colorful, the ice caps growing, and then 80,000 people cultivating their peak pleasure state, their own creative energy, their own pleasure inside of them. And at the moment of peak pleasure, they are imagining this thing for the planet. And just standing there with my family, with my ex-husband, with his new wife, with my new daughter that's on the way, like this is the thing that I can't stop seeing. And so that's the vision I invite all of you to hold with me, because it's the type of dream that doesn't make sense in this world, in this reality. And yet I know that by holding it and by saying it out loud to a bunch of dreamers, we will bring in this new earth to meet it, and they will meet in a handshake. And so I know it's audacious, but you know, I said it, and then Gio, you're like, I can fill a stadium for you. I have that dream, right? And like, now you guys have planted the seed. We're going to help to make it so. So that's my future self dream.
Nice. Love that. Nicole?
Very hyper specific.
Yeah, perfect.
I love that. You're almost selling out though. I'm seeing a lot of people in the comments signing up for this event, and definitely count me in too. So I think in terms of my future self, continuing to empower people to find themselves, to find their purpose, their passion. I mean, this beautiful conversation we had today is why I show up every day with the content on social media, with the Self-Healer Circle, the membership, with the books that I write. My hope is to roll out an opportunity to teach other people how to guide, from teachers and coaches, people on this holistic journey. I see us all showing up and shedding all of this identity, right, that isn't in alignment, as the major way that we create the change that we're making in the world. So the more that I can inspire one other person to support someone else in finding themselves, that for me would be a life well lived here.
Beautiful.
Fan that flame.
Yeah, for me, I believe that my future self will have much clearer perspectives than I do, and their values will be a lot more simplified, goals a lot more simplified as well, and just a lot deeper meaning. But if I was just to put myself in the context of like 5 years out, I think about my oldest son in 5 years will be age 19. Really excited for where he'll be. He's doing an enormous amount of tennis right now. He wants to play like college tennis, you know what I mean? And so like, I think about where he'll be. He'll probably want to like serve some mission of sorts as well, depending on, where he's at that point. I just kind of think about my family, like all my kids will be 5 years older. My older three that we adopted will be 19, 17, and 15. I believe we're going to live where we still live. Our current game plan is that we're going to be in Florida until our 10-year-old son is at least 18. So we're probably going to be here for at least for now. Obviously things can change. In a year from now, we may have totally different goals. But for now, our game plan is to stay in Florida where we currently live. And my main focus is my older three kids and just their development through their teen years, and just setting them up for as much success as possible. So in 5 years from now, I hope that they're all just killing it and doing amazing. And then for me, I just hope I'm still writing absolutely amazing books. Hopefully they get better and better. One thing I've been thinking a lot about writing this next book that I'm writing, which is with Dan Sullivan. It's called 10X is easier than 2X. And yeah.
True. Yes.
Yeah. And like, before you go 10X bigger, you've got to become 10X better. Qualitative change precedes quantitative change. And so I'm really looking forward to just deliberately practicing and getting better and better at my craft, but also learning a lot of new things. So yeah, I think my future self is just writing better books, increasingly focused on my older three kids, having a lot of peak experiences. And I don't know what else my future self's doing at the moment.
I think 6 kids is plenty. You're doing good.
I'm
Six
not having
books, 6
more.
kids.
Trust me. There's no more kids coming.
I love all three of you. Thank you so much for hanging out today. I just looked down at the coffee I had in front of me and look what it says on here. I don't know if you can see it.
Be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
So I feel like that's the theme for today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Can't wait to have all of you back again. See you soon. And for everyone who joined live, thank you for investing and spending your time with all of us. I hope that was useful. Please take one thing you learned today, share it somewhere on, let's say, Instagram, tag all of us so we can see what you learned. And we'll see you all next time.
With your true personality finally aligned, it's now time to streamline your life. Are you ready to transition into a machine? I'm here to tell you that you, my hero friend, need to learn how to operate more efficiently. See you next time, as our next set of guides will show you how to become a productive powerhouse.